Well, this is where personality enters again. But before I talk about the aspect of personality, there are some basic geopolitical calculations. He wants to defend Castro against what he assumes will be an American invasion, following up on the abortive invasion at the Bay of Pigs in 1961. He wants to rectify what he understands to be an imbalance in strategic nuclear strength in favor of the United States by putting missiles in Cuba. He wants to show the Chinese, who are yapping at his heels, that he is not going to lose Cuba. So there are lots of reasons like this that others might have had to consider a move like this. But what sends him over the top is a personality which I believe, and here I'm going to actually use a technical term if I may. I'm not a psychologist, I'm not a psychiatrist, but the CIA gathered 20 of those people in the spring of 1961 to take the measure of this man's personality, and they said in effect that he was hypomanic, which is a fancy word, as I understand it, for bipolar. He was a man with manic episodes and periods of depression. And my own guess is that he took the decision to send these missiles to Cuba in one of these up periods because it's characteristic of people in that mood to think they can do anything, that they're supermen. And that's what this decision seems to bespeak.
All too soon, in 64, he's toppled by, in many ways, protégés, really. The group that he had brought up and replaced the old Stellan crowd with. Overthrow him for reasons, I suppose, good and bad, a mix. But still, I mean, how much had he already set in motion? Essential reforms that perhaps you could still see today running through, down to Gorbachev and Yeltsin. And
well, actually, he set things in motion. But even more important, I would say, he set people in motion. In the course of my current research, I'm writing a biography now of Gorbachev, and I've talked to him. He talks about how he considers himself a child of the 20th Congress. That is, a person who came to political maturity under Khrushchev. Now, even Gorbachev was not sad to see Khrushchev go, because by the time he went, he had done so many things that were embarrassing, dangerous, etc. But the idealism of Khrushchev, the hope to reform this country, lived on in the hearts and minds of the people of that era, who were called Shestidesiatniki. That's men and women of the 60s, the 1960s. And when they came to power in 1985, Gorbachev and his colleagues, they picked up the torch that Khrushchev had dropped and resumed the work that he had begun.
What do you think Putin and his crowd would make of Khrushchev today?
I think that they would, on the one hand, be proud of him because he threw his weight around and used the weight of his country to make an impact on the world, and that's precisely what they are trying to do again. But on the other hand, they are much smoother than he is, much more sophisticated, much less ideological, much more consistently nationalist and statist. So I think on the whole they would find good things to say about him, but probably find him an embarrassment.
In your studies, I'm sure you watch events right in Russia today, and where do you think Putin may be taking the country right now? And your book certainly brings out the importance of the personality in history, so we have to all address that question. Where is Putin taking Russia?
What's unique about him, if something is that he's incredibly smart and shrewd and careful and Machiavellian and has just swept all before him, with a little assistance, of course, from oil and natural gas prices. But where he's trying to take the country, I would say, he's trying to create an authoritarian, not a totalitarian state, and to make it again into a great power, not a superpower. And he's succeeding.
There are, of course, terrible human rights abuses still in Russia, but do you think that the horror, the ability of that society wants to have mass murder, do you think that's been squeezed finally out of the system, that going back to that kind of dictatorship now is extremely unlikely?
I think going back to a communist dictatorship is unlikely, probably impossible.
Of course.
Maybe going back to a different kind of dictatorship, worse than Putin's, is possible. I think that would be a kind of what they sometimes call it red-brown dictatorship, a kind of mixture of fascism and leftism, a kind of nationalist, patriotic dictatorship. I would hope that won't happen. And even if it does, I think for a while Russia has been inoculated against the kind of mass murder and terror that took place in the 30s. The one thing people don't want is to go back to that. But who knows, in a generation when that's been forgotten, or at least nobody's alive anymore who lived through it, who knows? I hope that despite some of Putin's best efforts, Russia is on a trajectory toward democracy. But precisely because of some of Putin's best efforts, it may be on a trajectory to a more fearsome dictatorship.
Well, you've given us a marvelous read. William Taubman, thanks very much indeed for joining us.
My pleasure.
And that's our show for this week. You can reach us at ourworld@cbc.ca. I'm Brian Stewart. For all of us here, thanks for watching. You can catch us next Sunday, 6:30 p.m. Eastern, 3:30 Pacific, and 7:30 p.m. in the Maritimes. We'll see you then.